of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. I want you to think for a minute of a really big mistake that you made at some time in the past. Not necessarily the worst thing you've ever done, but some decision or action that you took that had seriously unpleasant consequences, either for yourself or for someone else. Focus for a minute on what happened and why you did what you did. And I'll give you a minute to think. Now, of course, I am making an assumption here that every one of us, no one in here is perfect, and every one of us has had at least a screw up or two somewhere in our past. And without dwelling on the gory details, I want you to think about the consequences. Not what, first was what happened. Now, what were the consequences of that mistake that you made? Again, I'll give you a minute to think. Did the mistake have consequences for you? How did people treat you? What were the effects of that big mistake? Now, how would you feel if that one action, that one mistake, became the whole story of your life? It was the only thing anyone ever remembered from you. If every time your name came up, someone would say, oh yeah, she's the one who did X. How could you go on knowing that a lifetime of good works would never erase that one act of anger or selfishness? Or the one time you refused to mend a broken relationship and forgive the person who hurt you? None of us wants the story of our lives to be the story of our failures. Well, luckily for we mistake-prone humans, the Bible is filled with examples of people who are remembered as heroes even though they were guilty of making serious bad decisions and mistakes, errors in judgment that caused pain to other people. People whose faith wasn't quite strong enough, or people who exercised judgment over compassion, or loved themselves instead of others. In other words, people in the Bible whose stories included the same shortcomings you and I are capable of, but the stories don't always end there. Let's look at a couple of these unheroic heroes from the Bible. One of my favorite characters in the entire Bible is Peter. I come from a family of very tall people, and I always picture Peter as tall. And while I know it's probably not true, I also picture Peter as a redhead. Just the temper, that thing. I see him as a big, burly man who talked loud, laughed deeply, was quick to act, a little slower to think first. A man who was used to hard physical work, not particularly educated, but well known and accepted by his community. Peter was also one of the first 12 individuals chosen by Jesus to follow him in his ministry. And he had a special position in the disciples group. He was part of the inner circle of the inner circle. because Peter, along with James and John, were with Jesus when he saw a vision of Elijah, and again with Jesus when he went into the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. It was also Peter who spoke up first. When Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you think I am?" Peter was the one who jumped up and said, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And at that point, Jesus was so impressed with Peter's getting it that he promised Peter would be the rock on which his church would be built. It was also Peter who took the risk of leaving his boat and walking on the water toward Jesus on the shore, an action for which he is famous, even though he lost his nerve and fell into the lake. And it was probably the impetuous Peter who, when the soldiers came to arrest Jesus, attacked the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Hardly an act of love your neighbor and nonviolence. Maybe Peter wasn't listening to that lesson about do unto others. And yet, when the going got tough, when it was really that crisis moment for Peter, Peter didn't just turn and run or look for a place to hide. In true Peter style, he flamboyantly denied everything. He publicly, loudly swore that he did not know that Galilean, that he had never even met the man. When his life was in danger, Peter became a coward, a liar, and a deserter. Now, how's that for a serious screw-up? At the other end of the social scale is the Apostle Paul. What's his story? Well, Saul, that was his name originally, was born a Roman citizen in a devout Jewish family in the large, influential city of Tarsus. He referred to himself as being of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew among Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee. His family had a history of religious piety and had been involved in the traditions and practices of the Pharisees for generations. And while he was still relatively young, Paul was sent to Jerusalem to study with one of the renowned experts on the Hebrew law. He was totally devoted to the law and to the thinking and living of it that he understood to be correct. And he was also insistent, sure, that everyone else should conduct their lives according to his definition of correct. When we first really see Saul, he's taking part in the death of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. And Saul is standing there within the crowd, holding the cloaks of the men who are throwing the stones at Stephen. And from this point on, we know that Saul persecuted the early Christians, in his words, beyond measure. The scripture says Saul was ravaging the church and entering house after house. He dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. Saul was so convinced he was doing the right thing that the violence and abuse toward those he believed to be breakers of the law was not just okay, it was something to be proud of. Can you imagine the chaos and misery that Saul inflicted in the name of God's law? In one of my several previous lifetimes, that's the advantage of being of a certain age. You can have multiple lifetimes in the past. Well, in one of mine, I was an 18-year-old freshman at East Texas Baptist College, and I took a class in Old Testament. The instructor, whose face is clear in my mind, but whose name long ago slipped out of my memory, was a retired minister, and he led us through the stories we had all heard before of the heroes and heroines of the Jewish faith, and by extension of the Christian faith. We heard the stories of Abraham and Sarah and David and Solomon and Elijah and Isaiah and Miriam and Moses and Jonah and Joel and Esther and all of those names that we have known for since childhood. And I love good storytelling, so I loved that class. It gave me a whole new appreciation for the history and the drama and the literature of the Bible. But the most important lesson I learned from that semester came from the professors continually reminding us that these heroic stories that have lasted forever are of real, normal, flawed human beings. These heroes made serious mistakes, had lapses in judgment that caused disastrous results. They were selfish and egotistical and conniving. And yet, as this professor, with his slight heavy Texas drawl, used to say, God used them anyway. And I would add, thank goodness God gives second chances. God may have created us perfect, but we didn't stay that way for very long. The human story has always been one of second chances. Our two unheroic heroes, yes, they changed themselves. Their stories changed, but they took full advantage of their second chances. Peter. Peter was never a shrinking violet, and he became a new and energized leader of the focused group of disciples after the execution and resurrection of Jesus. Almost immediately, he was a vocal spokesperson for the man he swore he never knew. On the day of Pentecost, which we will celebrate next week, his preaching was so persuasive that 3,000 people became believers. And throughout the rest of his life, Peter was the rock, the foundation of the new faith. He preached, he traveled, he took chances, he fought the system. He filled his story with all the actions that Jesus had predicted. And Paul, well, his second chance came as a bit dramatic. I suppose a person so self-important and so committed to his efforts to the law needs an above and beyond impressive encounter to get him to change his mind. So when traveling to Damascus to attack the heretical followers of Jesus, Saul is suddenly struck blind. That is followed by 3 days of panic and fear as he sits in a stranger's house, unable to see and totally helpless. And then at the end of the 3 days, Saul is visited by one of the very people he was intent on finding and punishing, possibly killing. And this man tells him that I can restore your sight, and he does. He gives him a new name, says you're now Paul, no longer Saul. And now what you're going to do is go out and do the exact opposite of everything you've done before. And that is exactly what Paul did. He took that second chance. He boldly told the story of Jesus of Nazareth. He founded new churches and instructed the people in how to live by the teachings of Jesus. His conversion experience changed him so profoundly that with his second chance, he applied the same energy and conviction to doing good that he had once used to cause pain and suffering. Paul became what he had once tried to kill. Now let me be clear here. I don't believe for a minute that either of these men became calm or gentle or compliant or easy to live with. I don't think their rough edges miraculously disappeared or their relationships with other people suddenly became smooth and cordial and cooperative. Yes, the lines in their story change, but neither of them became a darling Prince Charming. Paul was never free of controversy, always in trouble with political leaders and other believers. Paul was still Paul. I always hear him as a little more arrogant, immovable in his convictions. And despite spending time in prison and despite his willingness to suffer for the cause, I always hear Paul's ego loud and clear. His letters to the early churches show him to be wise and grateful for their help, but also insistent in his attitudes and his view of what the new church should and should not look like. And Peter? Throughout the rest of his life, Peter was at the center of arguments and dissension as the early church evolved. His voice never became soft. He didn't change from rough fisherman to fashionable gentleman. And I think working with Peter would have required extraordinary patience and self-discipline, because Peter didn't have either one of those. Peter kept the faith and did the work, but he was still Peter. You see, being given a second chance doesn't mean we become a different person, not some totally perfect version of our previous selves. It doesn't mean that the harm we've done is excused or wiped away. And in order to adequately really take advantage of our second chance, sometimes we have to begin with asking forgiveness, especially when our errors and poor judgment and poor decisions have caused pain to others or disappointment to God. Being given second chances does mean, as my Old Testament professor would say, we are all flawed, and God uses us anyway. When I was working on this message, at first I basically ended it there. Hadn't quite decided where to go next. But then I wanted to focus on the fact that the assurance of God will always give us multiple chances. And I do believe that God is steadfast, ever present, and won't give up on us. But then there was another mass murder, a senseless tragedy against children in a place where they should have been safe, where they should have been laughing and learning and growing and experiencing life. There are now more victims of our failure as a society to do something about our fixation on guns. Yet another example of how refusing to take action to solve a problem that is entirely of our own making. And I began to wonder how many second chances God is willing to give us when we squander them so carelessly. I can and do grieve with the families affected by this latest shooting and with the families of the previous attacks who have to relive their horror every time there's another one. I can speak in a setting like this about my opinions. I can pray for everyone involved, including the family of the shooter. But my prayers will not prevent the next nightmare until I take real action to force change, and I continue to take action until my hope becomes reality and the change is actually present. Until that happens, I share in the responsibility for the disasters. I cannot wholly blame others for tragedies I have done nothing to prevent. You see, being granted second chances is just page 1 of our story. The full story is written when we embrace those second chances with the insights gained from previous failures, and with honest appraisal of our powers, our willingness to work, and our belief in the inevitable goodness of man. The full story is written when, with others as committed and as flawed as ourselves, we keep working to accomplish something important. The full story is written when we keep working and keep working and keep working, grounded in the knowledge that we are children of a God who loves us all, who knows us all, who expects great things from us all, and will never, ever leave us. I do not have the answers. I just pray to be part of the solution. May our stories be filled with hard work and joyous results and many, many second chances. Thanks be to God. Amen.